Good afternoon, everybody. My name's David Russell, and I'm chair of the Transition Pathway Initiative Limited, the asset owner board that set up the TPI some years ago. You're here to listen to a webinar by the TPI Centre, which is part of the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics, and has a team of 28 analysts and technical staff that undertake the analysis that supports the TPI data. This is one of a series of webinars that the TPI Centre undertakes roughly every 6 weeks to showcase the research that the centre is doing and ensure that investors and others around the world are aware of the quality of data and the information that we are providing to help companies, help investors understand the transition and how that information is used. Some of the other webinars that have been around ASCOR, the Assessing Sovereign Climate Opportunity Risk, the oil and gas sector, food producers and banking, to name just a few. This afternoon, you're here to listen to a webinar and discussions around the TPI Centre's Management Quality Score, but also the CA100 disclosure framework and how they are linked and where the differences are. We've had over 300 registrations for this event, so obviously people are keen to understand more about the relationship between the Management Quality Score and the CA100 disclosure framework questions and KPIs. Firstly, a bit of background about the TPI. It was set up by a group of asset owners in 2016, 2017, in the wake of the Paris COP, where transition became a buzzword. The challenge that we as investors had at the time was we didn't know how to measure how companies then were transitioning. The only tool we really had was carbon footprinting, and that was more backward looking. So we worked with our academic partner, the London School of Economics, and FTSE Russell, our data provider, and they provide some of the underlying data for the Management Quality Score, to develop a process which has developed from a few companies being assessed in 2016, 2017 when TPI was launched, to, as of yesterday, 2,000 companies released on the website for our Management Quality Score. Obviously, a lot more information about TPI is on the website, but I think it's important to understand some of the key principles behind the TPI. It's based on academically robust research and independent research, hence the link with the TPI Centre and the London School of Economics. It's based on public disclosures. So we only use publicly available information to make the assessments. No black box, no questionnaires sent to companies where you don't understand where the data comes from. It also, they're very transparent methodologies about how the assessments are undertaken. They're all available on the TPI website, as are all the data that we currently produce. It is open access to encourage more investors to use the data. We have 150 plus formal supporters of TPI, representing around $80 trillion worth of assets. We're always after more. So if anyone would like to become a supporter of TPI, and sorry, it's worth saying that we have 150 official supporters, but there are many, many more organizations, asset managers and asset owners around the world actually using our data. So if people are interested in becoming more aware of how to support TPI, please get in touch. There's an email address at the end of the presentation. It's worth knowing that TPI Centre does assessments in 4 different areas. There's firstly the companies, which were the start point, but also ASCOR, that sovereign debt side, the banking sector, because of the importance it plays in funding or not funding the transition. And 4th area is the CA100 plus benchmark, which TPI has been supporting as a data provider from not long after it was launched. CA100 plus was launched also in 2017, initially at the Berlin PRI in-person event, but then formally launched by the investor groups, the IIGCC, the PRI, the AIGCC, et cetera, around the world at the end of 2017. So it's been going for a number of years now, and TPI has been supporting that since inception, really. You're going to hear about the processes involved in TPI management quality scores and also the CA100 assessment benchmark process from Shafrak Ashraf and Rob Ingram from the TPI Centre. There'll then be a panel discussion with and Rob will introduce the speakers and what's going to be covered. Just to be aware that you can ask questions. There's a Q&A box if you look at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please put questions in, and we'll do everything we can to answer them. Just to remind you that this is being recorded and will be available on the TPI's website a few days after the end of the event. And firstly, to apologise to our Australian colleagues, because I suspect there aren't many of them up at 3 o'clock in the morning to watch this. So at least you'll have access to the recording. I'll now hand over to Rob, who's the project lead on management quality at the TPI Centre, and he will introduce the rest of the agenda and the speakers. Thanks very much and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, David, and hello everyone. Welcome to the webinar on navigating corporate climate frameworks with a specific look at the Climate Action 100+ framework and the TPI Management Quality framework, looking really at the similarities and differences between the two and hoping to clear up any confusion as to why we have two different frameworks for assessing publicly listed equities. In terms of the agenda, obviously David's given us a great introduction there and a good overview of the work of TPI. Very shortly, Shafak and I will launch into a framework overview presentation looking at the Climate Action 100+ framework and also the Management Quality framework. After that, we're delighted to be able to offer a panel discussion with Carlota Garcia Manas, Head of Climate Transition and ESG Engagement at RLAM, and Chris van der Merwe, who's the Responsible Investment Manager at Brunel Pension Partnership, and he's also a member of the Strategic Advisory Committee for TPI. All being well, there'll be a good few minutes at the end of that for a Q&A session where we can pick up any questions related either to the presentation or the panel discussion, and hopefully continue the discussion there. Great, and just to go over a few points which have already been picked up by David, just to reiterate them very quickly. TPI Centre is the academic research partner of TPI Limited, which is the global asset owner-led initiative supported by asset managers and service providers. It's an independent and rigorous source of research and data into the progress made by corporate and sovereign entities in the transition to a low carbon economy. Potentially, most importantly, it's an open access tool, so the data is publicly available. One little caveat around that: we're obviously discussing management quality and CA 100+ here, so the management quality data is all available on the TPI website. If you want to know more about the CA 100+ framework and scores of companies against that framework, then you need to go to the CA 100+ website. But all that data is also freely available there. In terms of the different entities that TPI does assessments of, as David mentioned, there's a banking framework and also a sovereign framework, which is ASCOR, which is assessing sovereign climate opportunities and risks. We won't be discussing those in any detail at all really today, although there have been recent webinars on those, which you can find on the TPI website. We'll be focused much more instead on management quality and CA 100+. The carbon performance assessments, which are sectoral decarbonisation approach towards assessing the climate intensity of different companies, will be touched on, but only briefly, in the sense that some of the data feeds into the CA 100+ framework. But those are essentially the projects that we'll be focusing this presentation on. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, really looking at the similarities and differences between the two frameworks, it's a propitious moment basically to mention that management quality data was uploaded yesterday morning. So if you go to the TPI website, you'll be able to find scores and assessments for 2,000 companies, as David mentioned. So just giving a very quick overview of that before we go into the different framework discussion. You can see here that MQ has doubled the number of companies that it displays data for, from 1,000 listed equities in 2023 to 2,000 in 2024. In terms of picking the companies to cover, we found that we'd reached something close to saturation for some of the more developed sectors that we've been looking at for a long time, regarding things like oil and gas, electricity utilities, etc. So this year we took a more sector agnostic approach to adding new companies, whereby we essentially ranked companies based on scope 1 and 2 emissions and then market cap as well, to decide which companies to add. And you can see in the table here that the result of that is that we added quite a few companies in some areas where we previously didn't have so much coverage. Things like consumer services, food producers, healthcare, telecommunications, etc., make up a fair percentage of the new entrants to the MQ universe. Added to that, you can see that previously, in terms of the non-core TPI sectors, so those non-high emitting sectors for which we have CP methodologies for, we used to just bucket them as consumer goods, other industrials, or services. Because we have so many new entrants from those kind of areas, we've actually aligned our non-core sector names with the industry classification benchmark. So you can see a lot of the companies that are researched newly for 2024, or at least displayed the first time in 2024, move into sectors such as consumer goods, consumer services, technology, communications, etc. Very briefly, because I know this is not entirely the point of the webinar, but just quickly the results of the scores that have been uploaded within the last day. We'll talk about the framework and what this means a little more in just a few minutes. But the MQ framework level 5, which is the one that I'll be referring to throughout this webinar, runs from level 0 to level 5. And you can see here that the absolute majority of companies sit on level 3 there. So over 1,100 of the 2,000 covered companies sit on level 3. And in fact, if you were to turn 0 to 5 into just a continuous variable and take the average score for a company, it would also be a 3 as well. So whichever way you cut it, level 3 is essentially what we see as the pass score in terms of where companies sit within the MQ framework. So just going into a little more in terms of what that means, what the MQ and CA 100 plus frameworks look like, and the actual timelines for how we arrived at these different frameworks. Management quality, as I've said, is a framework it's a stepwise framework that's got 6 different levels. It's got 23 indicators across it, placed on those different levels. And essentially, a company is placed on a level depending on which of these indicators it does and doesn't meet. So, for example, a company that's on level 3 means that they have met all of the indicators on level 0, 1, 2. As you'd expect, the indicators on the earlier levels tend to be easier to meet. So does a company have a policy commitment to act, to actually disclose scope 1 and 2 emissions, for example? Whereas the level 4 and level 5 indicators tend to be more complex. So has the company undertaken a climate scenario planning exercise? Does it disclose an internal price of carbon? Does it give granular information about how it's going to meet its emissions targets, etc.? I should say the underlying data for all of this is supplied by our data partner, FTSE Russell, collect this data for their own ESG score, and we essentially amalgamate some of those scores and some of that data to produce these separate indicators for management quality. I'll now hand over to Fact to talk a little bit more about the CA 100 plus disclosure framework.
Thank you, Rob, for the introduction to management quality. Now let's talk about the Climate Action 100 plus. So Climate Action 100 plus is an investor-led initiative to ensure the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters take appropriate action on climate change. The Net Zero Company Benchmark is a tool provided to investors to better understand the transition plans of companies. The first and the main component of the Net Zero Company Benchmark is the disclosure framework that the TPI Center provides data to the CA 100 Plus initiative for. And the second component of the disclosure of the Net Zero Company Benchmark is the alignment assessments that are covered by other research partners of the initiative. For the purpose of this webinar, we will only be focusing on the disclosure framework. The disclosure framework constitutes of 54 metrics across 11 indicators. These indicators and metrics within cover a range of topics. These include the first 4 indicators on target setting by companies across different timeframes, followed by assessing what the decarbonization strategy and CapEx allocation looks like, essentially checking if the actions and money allocation are aligned with the set commitments of the companies. The indicators further look into climate governance of a company, their lobbying activities, just transition actions and commitments a company has in place, and even dwelling into what the historical emission reductions of assessed companies looks like. Now, displaying all 54 metrics and walking you all through that would be quite a dense exercise, but already from a high-level overview, it is somewhat perhaps apparent that the Climate Action 100+ disclosure framework goes deeper and a bit beyond the remits of management quality, or MQ for short. The reasons and nuances of this will become clearer in the next section, but for now, to set the scene further, let's talk about the inception of these frameworks and how they have evolved over time. So the CA100+ initiative was launched in 2017 by a coalition of over 200 institutional investors as a collaborative global initiative. Its focus is on engaging the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters to take meaningful action on climate change. The initiative was established with the key objective of urging companies to make clear commitments to reduce emissions, improve governance, and enhance both climate-related financial disclosures and transition plans. The initial disclosure framework for assessing companies was developed in 2020, with TPI Center selected to conduct research and analysis for the disclosure framework. The first assessments were published in early 2021. Since then, the assessments have been conducted annually, with notable expansions in both the number of companies assessed, now totaling 165, and the range of topics covered. In version 2 assessments that were published in 2023, new indicators focusing on the transparency of company targets and historical GHG emission reductions were launched. This iteration of 2023 also included heavy modifications to the decarbonization strategy, CapEx, and just transition indicators. The most recent assessments published in October 2024 introduced new metrics tracking the increase or decrease of historical Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that sets the scene for CA100+, and moving on to the management quality framework. The version 1 of the management quality framework for the TPI was developed through iterative research, testing, and review process from October 2015 to December 2016. The first iteration contained only 14 indicators. The TPI management quality assessments are based on the data provided by FTSE Russell. Specifically, the data and indicators FTSE Russell uses to develop its ESG ratings. These indicators align with how investors articulate their expectations of companies on climate change. There was a substantial testing and peer review process before the publication of the first assessments in January 2017 for 20 large oil and gas companies and 20 large electricity utility companies. Since then, the management quality framework has gone through multiple versions, including becoming better aligned with the final recommendations of the TCFD. The most recent major update has been for version 5.0, which was launched in 2023, in which a new level of transition planning and implementation was introduced, which increased the number of total indicators to 23. The additional indicators created a focus on whether companies are providing some granular detail around their emission reduction plans and whether they're aligning capital allocation with their stated climate targets. So now that everyone has hopefully a decent overview of what the two frameworks entail and how they evolved, and we have made your way the long way for the juicy bit, as I would like to call it, let's start going into the weeds of what makes them both unique. So firstly, the purpose of both frameworks differs and thus impacts what they measure. The MQ framework is a sequential high-level assessment of climate management practices and governance, whereas the CA100+ disclosure framework digs into the granular details of the transition planning of top corporates. While looking at their methodologies, the MQ adopts a qualitative approach to the assessment of indicators, whereas the disclosure framework uses both qualitative and quantitative evaluations across indicators. In terms of granularity, both remain sector agnostic. However, the disclosure framework goes further into granular details than the management quality. The granularity is detailed in the number of assessment units, that is the metrics or indicators, where CA100 plus disclosure has almost twice the number of metrics than MQ. Now it's natural to wonder why. CA100 plus goes into the granular details, whereas MQ remains relatively high level. And this can be captured in the next slide, where we discuss company coverage in detail. So we are all quite aware that what the transition plan of a small utility company and that of a globally leading utility will look largely different and have separate expectations from investors. As you can see on this slide, that management quality covers roughly 2,000 companies with a median market cap of $12.5 billion US dollars, whereas CA100 Plus focuses on only the top 165 GHG corporate emitters with a median market cap of $38 billion US dollars, which has almost tripled that of the company coverage of MQ in terms of the market cap. The need of the hour for extensive assessments of corporate plans, such as that by CA100 Plus, remains limited to the corporates responsible for the 80% of the global GHG emissions. That is the focus list of CA100 Plus. With that, I would hand over to Rob, who will walk you through some more comparisons between the two frameworks in detail.
Thank you, Shafak. Yes, so I think we've had a good kind of overview of some of the differences between the frameworks. To kind of really understand it, I think it's useful to look at a thematic area and see the kind of indicators that we have across the two frameworks. So we look here at targets first of all, and you can see that within management quality there are three indicators related to targets. The first two ask, has the company set a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target, or has the company set quantitative targets for reducing its greenhouse gas emissions? A question that often comes up is, how can a company meet level 7, indicator 7, but not indicator 4? What is a target that's not quantitative? Here we'd accept things like a company stating that it plans to lower intensity of scope 1 or 2 emissions, or reduce energy consumption in its own operations, or things like that. So things that aren't directly measurable, they're clearly an indicator of a target they have for reducing emission. Additional to that, there is one time-specific target that's included within the management quality framework. It says, has the company set a long-term quantitative target for reducing its greenhouse gas emissions? So here, by long-term, that's 5+ years into the future. So essentially for these assessments, it's looking post 2030. Does a company have a target there for reducing emissions in addition to anything that's over the shorter time period? If we compare that to what Climate Action 100 has with regards to targets, you can see that it has quite a number of time-specific target metrics. So firstly, asks if a company has set an emissions reduction target over the long, medium, or short term. And for CA100 Plus, short term is over the next 3 years, and medium is from the end of that period up until 2035, and long term is from 2035 up until 2050 normally. There are then submetrics within that essentially says, when it comes to those long, medium, and short term emissions reduction targets, do they cover at least 95% of the company's scope 1 and 2 emissions? And then further again, does a company have a long, medium, or short-term emission reduction target that covers the most relevant scope 3 emissions categories for its sector? So for something like oil and gas, for example, the most relevant scope 3 emissions are category 11, looking at use of sold products, etc. So there's a focus over 3 different time periods and across scope 1 and 2 separately as well, and the coverage of that. And as you can see, there's additional granular detail about the type of targets that a company is setting. When it comes to further target metrics that CA100 Plus has, there's 2 on whether a company has set an ambition to achieve a net zero GHG emissions target by 2050 or sooner. That's for scope 1 and 2 and scope 3. And there's also one which attempts to ask if a company is setting a target and whether it's converted that to an absolute value. So if it does have an emissions target for reducing the intensity of its emissions? Does it estimate what that's going to lead to in terms of the absolute emissions that reductions that you'll see as a result of that? So as you can see, when it comes to targets, there's far more granular detail captured within the CA 100 plus assessment than there is within the management quality one. Looking at another thematic area, emissions, we find a relatively similar story. So when it comes to scope 1 and 2 emissions, management quality has got a couple of questions. So firstly, fairly straightforwardly, has the company published information on its scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions? And secondly, has it had that data verified? Those are two questions about scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then two further questions about scope 3 emissions. So does the company report on scope 3 emissions? And that can be any category of scope 3 emissions, really, in order to score. And secondly, does the company disclose materially important scope 3 emissions? So again, in terms of what's considered materially important, those are aligned between CA 100 plus and management quality in terms of the different sectors and the different category of scope 3 emissions, which are considered to be relevant. When it comes to metrics on emissions within Climate Action 100 plus, it's taken more or less as a given that a company will publish information on its scope 1 and 2 emissions. So instead, the first question on scope 1 and 2 emissions is whether the company's absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions have decreased in the past year relative to the previous year and over the past 3 years. And there's a similar set of questions about emissions intensity. So has the company's GHG emissions intensity decreased in the past year, over the past 3 years, or at a fast rate faster than that projected by a credible 1.5 degree pathway? So those are 3 different indicators. So this is essentially one thing that MQ doesn't have, which is a series of metrics that are looking back at the past and saying, in addition to the targets the company is setting and the current disclosure, can we see over the past few years a decrease in absolute or emissions intensity from that company? Additionally, there are two metrics that ask whether a company can provide more information about the main actions that have driven any scope 1 and 2 or scope 3 emissions changes. So you'll say to a company, yes, we can see that your scope 1 and 2 emissions have gone up and down or down. Can you explain why that's the case? Is it because of an increase in products sold? Is it to do with a change in what you're selling or what you're manufacturing? Is it to do with decarbonisation processes that you have within your plants, etc.? So looking to see if companies disclosing, on a more granular level, why there are year-on-year changes in emissions. Obviously, there's no time to go through every single area of similarity and difference, but just a quick overview of some of them. Again, so when it comes to scenario analysis, there is an MQ indicator on this. So does the company undertake climate scenario planning? And CA 100 plus actually has 2 metrics on this, which look at whether that scenario analysis that was undertaken is a 1.5 degree scenario analysis. And it also then asks a couple of further questions as to whether the company can disclose the variables that were used in that analysis, whether there are quantitative results from that analysis that they can point to. When it comes to climate lobbying, within MQ, there's a question about the consistency between the climate change policy of the company and the trade associations of which it's a member. Within CA 100 plus, there's actually 5 metrics on climate lobbying, which look very specifically at whether the company is dedicated to lobbying in a way which is Paris aligned, and also its behavior within the trade associations of which it's a member, and whether it operates in a way that's Paris aligned there as well. When it comes to board climate change credibility, there's a couple of indicators here from MQ. One is whether there's a board member or board committee with oversight of climate change policy. And there's a separate one that looks at whether remuneration incorporates climate change performance. Again, CA 100 plus offers some similar metrics, but also a little bit more detail. So there's 2 on board oversight. So there's a particular member of the board with oversight of climate change issues and energy transition issues. Also, if there's a body that reports to the board on those issues. On remuneration, there's the question about whether board members' remuneration incorporates climate change performance, but also more specifically, whether the targets that are identified earlier in the framework are linked to remuneration as well, those board members. And finally, there's two metrics on competencies within the board. So do they disclose which board members have got competencies when it comes to climate change and energy transition, and how does it go about measuring those competencies? Finally, in terms of strategy to meet GHG reduction targets, this is probably the area where there's closest alignment. So there are 4 metrics within the MQ framework. These all make up the new level 5 that look at whether the company is disclosing granular information about how a company is going to meet its emissions reduction targets, and also about how a company, or whether a company, is aligning its planned CapEx spending with its targets that it has in place. There are similar, though not identical, questions within the CA100+ framework as well. Not identical because they're often contingencies and particular targets identified earlier in the framework. Those are asking about. But there's also an additional metric that asks, can a company, when it's disclosed what levers it's going to pull to meet its emissions reduction targets, can it say which, under the current policy and technological environment we have, which are viable and which depend on developments in the future in order for it to meet these targets?
Okay, thank you, Rob. It is apparent from the previous slides that even where there is a thematic overlap, like many frameworks and initiatives out there, the methodologies for both the CA100+ disclosure framework and the management quality framework vary depending on where granular details are required or not. And it is also important to highlight that both frameworks were developed to meet demands of varying investor requirements regarding transition plans at large, and just focus on top corporates. Bearing that in mind, let's focus on areas on thematic areas where there is no crossover. First, within the management quality framework, we have this indicator: does the company disclose on internal price of carbon, which is only covered within the management quality framework. Similarly, within CA100+, there are certain metrics on climate solutions, just transition and financial disclosures that are not covered by management quality in any capacity. Now, this goes back to the point of having different expectations for companies operating in different market caps and varying in size. CA100+ disclosure framework looks at the amount of CapEx allocated to present green investments and future green investments, including digging into the just transition plans and commitments with the focus placed on certain stakeholders, such as workers and communities. Lastly, the CA100+ framework also looks at the company's disclosures and seeing whether they are aligned with pioneering frameworks such as TCFD and more recently IFRS's S2. Now, this concludes our presentation, and we hope this brings the audience and the investor community with clarity on the differing technical use of both frameworks. And with that, I would hand over back to our moderator for the session, Rob.
Thanks, Shafak. We realised that was a fairly whistle-stop tour of the 2 different frameworks, but we are slightly time limited as to the amount of information we can discuss during that segment. But I think it's useful now to move on to, from the high-level overview of the differences, to actually have the panel discussion and actually focus on the use cases. So this data that's produced, how it's actually used by asset owners and asset managers. So I'm delighted that for this panel discussion, I can be joined by, I previously introduced them, but to introduce them again, Carlota Garcia Manos, the Head of Climate Transition and ESG Engagement at RLAM, and Chris van der Merwe, the Responsible Investment Manager at Brunel Pension Partnership. Carlota and Chris, thank you very much for joining us. You can, of course, give further details on your roles and within those organisations if you'd like. But if I could first start with a question to kick us off. There we've talked about MQ and CA100+ at length. If you could walk us through how your team actually use the MQ and CA100+ assessment. Carlota, maybe if I could come to you on that first.
Thank you very much. And I apologize. I don't know what has happened with my camera, but it's very dark. It's the same light as at the beginning, but I drop the video and I cannot get it to work. So apologies if my image is a little bit dark. Delighted to join you in this discussion. Um, I have a team of analysts and engagers that use multiple sources of information, and indeed the TPI management quality, but also the carbon performance assessments, and also Climate Action 100 Plus are one of multiple benchmarks and inputs that we use. They one of multiple inputs, but we use them mostly at the individual indicator level. Having said that, because they're publicly available and when the companies or issuers that we analyze and engage with overlap, they can also serve a dual purpose, can be used as a head starter for the assessment process or a tester of our conclusion. So that is very, very useful. It's interesting that at the moment we are reevaluating our internal alignment assessments, and we are looking at these two frameworks as potential further input. So hopefully, if we speak 1 year from now, I can give you more insights into whether we are using any of these frameworks in more detail.
Thanks, Carlotta. That's interesting to know. And I think the fact that you use the individual indicators goes back to the useful information that these are all free to access, and you get more than just an overall score. You do get the individual indicator scores on the website, so it does allow for that kind of use case. Chris, if I could maybe put the same question to you, could you talk a little bit about how you utilize the TPI Center's MQ and CA100 Plus assessment?
Yes, thank you, Rob. So there's kind of 4 key areas in which we use the TPI indicators, and very briefly, but we use it in FTSE Russell Paris line benchmarks. So this we kind of developed in coordination with FTSE Russell. So it not only meets the kind of the standard requirements of the EU criteria, but it also goes that step further by integrating the forward-looking metrics. But then also that kind of government protections from TPI, that kind of being the management quality indicators. Then it is also in our voting guidelines. So we selectively engage and vote against relative company directors that are in the broader TPI universe. So where they do not at least meet that kind of par score that you mentioned of level 3, we will vote against the directors. And then kind of to the net zero frameworks, which Carlotta touched upon, where we sometimes work with investment managers, and the TPI framework is a very useful reference point to share with investment managers when they're trying to develop their own internal kind of alignment indicators as well. But where we use kind of both the TPI and the climate action indicators is in our quarterly risk reporting. So this is at the moment mainly focused on listed equities and corporate bonds, but kind of looking to identify and manage that kind of climate risk. So on the TPI management quality at a portfolio level, we look at the coverage in relation to the metric to kind of establish that context. So obviously, I'm quite excited about the universe doubling from yesterday. But then what we've done is we have categorized the management quality levels into a red, yellow, amber, and green kind of criteria to kind of understand the risk. And this enables us to kind of build a meaningful view of the companies and that distribution of the portfolio. This then helps our portfolio manager to kind of track that distribution over time and to really identify if there's an increasing risk of management risk. So with companies that fall below that par score, and especially those are 0 to 1, that will kind of mean there's direct, the investment manager will then kind of query with the asset manager on what is the case there. And the aim here is for the portfolio manager to understand why the asset manager believes the company has kind of that potential to align in the future, and understanding what the actions are required to do that. So then the portfolio manager will kind of look at that response from the asset manager to understand or have that judgment of whether they think that transition risk is being adequately managed in the broader portfolio. And then just to quickly touch upon the Climate Action 100 indicators. So using those indicators, we've created a set of criteria which flags companies whether they don't meet kind of our minimum alignment. And this also places companies in that red, yellow, amber, and green kind of criteria to understand the risk. And this forms our minimum kind of requirement of companies. So of course we want companies to exceed these standards, but what happens is that if companies that Brunel hold, if they're flagged and they're not meeting these alignment criteria, either through the indicators themselves or from credible kind of reasoning from the manager, they could possibly face selective divestment within 12 months if they do not improve with new Climate Action 100 results. But this is kind of a process that we will kind of review every year to make sure that we kind of keep up with how the market is developing and kind of policy developments. But the TPI Management Quality and the Climate Action data really kind of form a key part of our kind of expectations with regards to climate alignment.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. It's great to hear that there's quite deep involvement with both the MQ and CA100 plus indicators and how those are used for holding companies and asset managers to account. I was wondering, you've talked kind of at a broad level there about how they're used. Do you have any kind of tangible examples or case studies that you could offer as to how you've used MQ or CA100 plus, for in the areas that you just highlighted?
Yeah, I think a good example I can give is Inui Conch, which is a Chinese cement company for those that are not familiar. So this flagged in our quarterly risk reporting last year, and it flagged on the TPI indicator, but also on our climate alignment process. So until the release of the latest TPI data last year, it was scoring 1 on the TPI Management Quality, and it was flagging in our kind of alignment process. So this then prompted our portfolio manager to ask for justification from the asset manager on kind of the alignment credentials of the holding. And the manager was able to kind of come back with a bit more of a nuanced view. But some of the key points they highlighted is that they felt there was evidence that the company was making an effort to improve its environmental impact. They also explained that the company had now actually disclosed their Scope 1 and 2 emissions and was also seen as leading in the sector in China for reducing harmful emissions. And then also they explained that the company was rapidly scaling its renewable energy capacity, having committed to investing about a quarter of its cash generation over the next 3 years into renewable energy. So what then happened is when the latest TPI data and Climate Action 100 benchmark was released, it actually showed that Inui had moved from a management quality level 1 to level 3, which I think for an emerging market company to be at par in that global universe is quite a material improvement. And then through our alignment process, it was also then not flagging anymore, kind of really showing that progress had been made. And I think this example just really shows how it's important to have that nuanced conversation with the manager, because they can kind of show you what the data might not be revealing, but also it shows how the indicators did actually reveal that once they were updated as well.
Thanks, Chris. That's really interesting. I mean, just to pick up one point you made, that for an emerging markets company in that particular sector to reach par 3 is quite a good sign. I would encourage people that haven't to look at the State of the Transition report that was released earlier this summer by TPI that does look at these things in terms of correlations between things like management quality scoring or CP alignment with things like the areas, the geographical areas in which they operate, the size of the company and the sectors they operate in, because it does give some more nuance as to which in which companies you see high performing companies and which areas you don't, which can be taken into account for these things. Carlotta, back to you here. Both CA100 Plus and MQ focus exclusively pretty much on publicly listed equities. Obviously, as an asset manager, you're also investing in credit issuers and private companies. Does either CA100 Plus or MQ inform those in-house assessments or any other framework? Can you tell us a little bit more about how you undergo those assessments for non-publicly listed equity?
Sure. For engagement, a majority of engagement is done at issuer level. So our assessment of transition and alignment are done at that level, and therefore pretty much aligned with the MQ and the Climate Action 100 framework. Where things become a little bit more, I'm going to say, interesting, challenging, is when we are evaluating emissions performance and portfolio decarbonization, and we may want to aggregate emissions or performance at the security level. And this is particularly true in credit portfolios. For this reason, for several years now, basically we have enriched the emissions database with proprietary methods. And it can be simple things like mapping interventions, where we map the emissions information to the appropriate vehicle, or in other cases, our analysts do extra desk-based research to make sure that the emissions data is accurate and up to date. We have used this extensively in our kind of housing associations and utilities exposures. And it's particularly true when maybe data vendors or research agencies will connect a parent company emissions to, and sometimes the parent is actually in a different sector, to the emissions that the security or the vehicle should have a portion, because that parent company may not be transferable. So we sometimes have had maybe a security in, say, water utilities, and the parent was based in Asia, and it was actually an oil and gas company. So if you simplistically try to apportion the size of the subsidiary and apportion the parent's emissions to the subsidiary by size of assets, it was a complete mismatch. So on that front, on the assessment and evaluation, we may need to do more of a rich evaluation and assessment.
Thanks. That's really interesting. I mean, I think the relation between parent companies and subsidiaries often plays a role, and it can be a little bit tricky, you know, to what extent, you know, emissions or loans or whatever it is are fungible, and to what extent they're very specific to one of the specific subsidiaries. It can be difficult and take a lot of extra research. Coming back to you, Carlotta, it'd be interesting to know, transition planning has become, you know, almost the buzzword. I think it's the, you know, integrated into the level 5 of the new NQ framework. It's focused on quite heavily now, I think. I was wondering if you could say, what areas of transition planning do you think there's, you know, more information needed or more assessments needed? You know, how can each of MQ or say 100 plus or whatever framework it is do more to give you information that you think you need to assess transition planning of companies?
Well, we just hosted a roundtable of kind of transition plan, almost luminaries, looking at what's next and what's needed on transition plans. It's very clear that there needs to be, and I think the IFRS and other bodies are really bringing to the fore the importance of linking financial and transition efforts. So in our case, as our team does a lot of the research and the engagement, but ultimately it's our colleagues, the portfolio managers and the investment professionals that will end up integrating that into their investment decision making. I think the more we can bring the sustainability or climate information to connect with company investment, cash flows, so that all of those investments and expenditures end up result in effective and efficient transition. So as we've seen in some of the frameworks, CapEx, OpEx, potentially also detail granular assessment may be required for private markets and asset-backed securities and other asset classes. I think that will be potentially a roadmap so that there is increasing coverage to be able to even evaluate benchmarks, not just portfolios, so that you can do comparative assessment. I think it's also important, I think has been a reflection of some of the conversation and disclosure that you have mentioned, to be very acutely aware of the difference between private and public companies, because they are subject to different disclosure requirements, such as listing rules. And then sometimes we can simplify the assessment, which is linked to disclosure, and presents a mismatch between the disclosure and the performance. So you could have two companies, one public, one private, with very similar performance, but with different disclosure. And the conclusion that you may reach is that one is worse than the other when they are both performing similarly. It's only that one of them is actually not disclosing because they don't have to. And the other thing that I will just wrap up is we've been doing just transition engagement and assessment since 2019, but we launched as well this year just adaptation. So as we all know, there may have been a reluctance to focus on adaptation because it looked almost like we have thrown the towel. But it's becoming apparent that even 1 degree extra temperature is going to require adaptation. So in that, and in that kind of point of view, we also started looking in a similar vein at the social potential externalities associated with adapting to climate change.
Cool. An interesting area. I think very difficult to map and analyze as well. So a lot of work ahead. Chris, one final question before we go to Q&A here. There are a number of sectors that are covered both by MQ and Zero 100 plus, high emitting sectors where the change in emissions intensity is unlikely to change in the near term, very, very much. So I was wondering if you could explain, if or how you use Zero 100 plus or MQ or other frameworks to give you confidence that companies within those sectors where we're unlikely to see those emissions intensity reduce quickly, that they're taking the net zero transition seriously.
Yeah, I think the first thing to probably stress here is just how important it is to kind of use a dashboard approach to metrics, to kind of not try and use something like emissions intensity in isolation, but to try and look at that full picture. So within Brunel's latest climate policy, we've kind of adopted a clear hierarchy of our targets where we kind of try and prioritize that real economy change to kind of support the net zero transition. And in that hierarchy, alignment is very much prioritized over emissions intensity. To kind of have that real world decarbonization rather than the paper decarbonization. And this has also been supported by the Net Zero Investor Framework, where they've changed their portfolio decarbonization target to a reference objective for kind of similar reasons as well. And where the TPI Management Quality and the Climate Action Indicators are very helpful is that they, of course, map across to the Net Zero Investment Framework. So it makes it very helpful in understanding the kind of broader alignment context, of which emission intensity is, of course, one element of that. But I think the TPI and the climate action indicators are really kind of starters for conversations rather than maybe an answer in themselves. So they really help us to kind of stimulate a conversation to kind of prioritize to see where there are gaps and to kind of where to focus our stewardship activities on what companies are not passing certain indicators, and then also maybe to compare them to peers that might be doing so. I think the frameworks also really help us to have more of an intelligent and nuanced conversations with managers to kind of understand, where a company might be heading. And then something to kind of what David mentioned at the start, but it also acts as a very kind of externally verifiable source that is really kind of consistent across managers. So for us as an asset owner with outsourced managers, it's very useful to use as a comparison between the different asset managers who might have their own frameworks. And then it also helps with kind of other stakeholders on the transparency point where we can show them how companies are performing. So therefore, I think we really value that the TPI and climate action data has that kind of transparent, independent, and is publicly available as a source. But the other point of having that full picture is, I think today is about the managing quality and the climate action indicators, but it's also that carbon performance element of TPI that I think is very much needed to kind of build that full picture of where a company is and where it's going as well.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks, Chris. That's been really interesting and enlightening. I think, and always nice for us to hear a little bit more about how the information and the data that we produce is used. We just have a little over 5 minutes left, so not a long time, but maybe we can pick up a few questions from the question and answer. I'll go through some, and I'll maybe pick one or two specific to MQ first that I can elaborate on. So there's one on electricity utilities companies. Scoring on levels of 1, 2, and 3, even if they've got a low carbon emitting power plants. And why do they score on levels 1, 2, and 3, even though they're unlikely to need to transit? So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the way that we go about selecting companies is done in a way which is done in a sector agnostic manner, and the indicators for transparency are applied in the same way to different companies, no matter the sector that they sit within. We do encourage, where possible, for people to review the MQ scores in addition to carbon performance scores, which will give you a more rounded overview of how the company's doing. So management quality, often, although this isn't an exact comparison, it's the input data. what a company says it's planning to do, and then the CP is the output. What actually is its carbon intensity of the of what it's under of its business. So that essentially is the answer that it is possible, and we've seen things like electric autos makers also score quite poorly on the MQ framework. But in order to remain transparent and impartial, we're not going to bump up particular companies or give them passes on particular indicators purely because of the sector that they sit within. There's another one quickly about whether the sequential order of MQ ever causes significant problems with a company being tripped up by scoring no early on within the framework. So it can happen occasionally. It's fairly rare. We do check these things, and there's very good correlation between the number of indicators the company scores on and the overall level that company sits on within the management quality framework, and also within some of the earlier indicators on levels 0, 1, and 2. You can score on those by also scoring on some of the indicators on levels 4 and 5, or levels 4 in particular. That's a way of trying to ensure that you don't have high-performing companies on those later indicators staying on levels 1 and 2. So it's not impossible. It can happen. It's why we do publish the information for all of the individual indicators rather than just the level score for a company. So you do have that more rounded assessment to look at. But yeah, it is fairly rare, but it does happen. Picking up on any other further questions that we can. So one I could maybe put to you, Carlotta and Chris, or maybe Carlotta in particular. Are there areas in which C100 Plus or MQ or other ways of assessing companies can demonstrate longevity of commitment to the transition, so that asset owners or managers make investment decisions that aren't so sensitive to things like changes in leadership or the political or cultural environments in which they operate?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one. Net zero stewardship has been the surprise of my career, where we have puzzling findings where we were seeing companies progressing and then deteriorating. And those can be for multiple reasons, from policy changes to anti-ESG sentiment, etc. I think we are taking ambitions and goals with a pinch of salt, unless they come with a clear evaluation of, say, marginal abatement cost curves, business model descriptions, alignment plans. So we just want, if there's going to be a target, is there information that underpin that target as of today? And do those details make sense?
Thanks, Carlotta. Trying to pick, I think we've probably only got time for one more question. So there's one here that says, other frameworks such as GFANS and the IIGCC and if a significant emphasis on climate solutions. Could you explain why the TPI indicators, MQ indicators, prioritize a different focus? Yeah, I mean, I think it is an area of interest, and what is a climate solution is obviously, and whether companies are producing climate solutions or not is something that's obviously extremely relevant for the transition. At the moment, it doesn't sit within the management quality framework, purely because applying that framework to 2,000 companies that sit across a huge number of different sectors does make that kind of assessment difficult. If you're looking at some, IT companies, food producers, etc., or maybe not food producers, but some of those different sectors where clearly identifying what a climate solution for them might be can be a little bit tricky. And I think until you've got kind of really clear steers on that, trying to design indicators that can be applied in a sector agnostic way across that number of companies can be a little bit tricky. There are some indicators within C100 Plus on climate solutions. I was wondering, Shafak, if you could give a little bit more information on that.
Yes, thank you, Rob. Happy to step in. I think there's one point that's important to clear over here with regards to a lot of questions on MQ, and there's another question on Shell specifically that might be helpful to flag, is that, as I've said in the presentation numerous times, is that the MQ Management Quality Framework from TPI is supposed to provide like higher level details and not the granular level details. The granular level details and the reason that why CA100 plus disclosure framework was launched, we have the net zero company benchmark, the disclosure framework that focuses only on these top GHG corporate emitting companies, is so we can go into the depth that we need to for these specific companies only. And like I've said before, for smaller companies of very and not so large market cap, it's not necessarily always relevant to go into these depth for investors. And a lot of the capital does lie with the companies that cover the largest market cap. That said, for climate solutions, we have 4 metrics within the CA100 plus disclosure framework that look into the CapEx allocation towards current climate solutions and future climate solutions, and also what the production of these climate solutions are. So we do have a bunch of indicators that cover this and provide details on what the companies are doing, whether their CapEx is allocated to climate solutions right now and in the future or not. So that's the nuance that we distinct between current green investments and future green investments, in other words, within the CA100 plus disclosure framework. And again, if you do look at the results, you will see that climate solutions is still quite upcoming in terms of what does climate solutions actually mean across different companies and sectors. And that's something that we'll have to see as this affair evolves.
Okay, thank you very much, Shafak. That unfortunately does bring us to time, so it just leaves me to thank Carlotta and Chris for joining me for this panel discussion, and to Shafak for the presentation, for David for doing the introduction. As we mentioned previously, the video should be available on the TPI website shortly. And I know there are some questions in the Q&A that we just didn't have time to get to, so we'll try and pick up on those if we have personal information and respond by email to those. Thank you very much for attending, and until next time.